Thank you, Madam Speaker, and it is indeed a pleasure and a privilege to rise in this House this afternoon to join the debate at second reading on Bill C-22, the Canada Disability Benefit Act. I'm particularly pleased to participate in this debate based on many of the conversations I've had over the last few weeks with constituents in my riding of Perth-Wellington. And I want to highlight one specific conversation I had last week. It happened at the local community food centre in my riding of Perth-Wellington. Now, for those of you who may not know what the community food centre is, it's a wonderful institution. Here in my riding of Perth-Wellington, it's called the Local. We just call it the Local. And I like to compare it to a kitchen. It obviously has a kitchen, but it's like a family kitchen, where when you enter, you're part of a family. And the people who greet you are always there with smiles. They're always there with a helping hand, and they're always there for a good conversation. So when I was invited to meet with community members to discuss issues affecting those living with disabilities, I was absolutely thrilled and honored to be able to participate in that conversation. And when I arrived last Friday, at the Local, there greeting me right away was Uncle Glenn with a big smile. Now, he's not officially my uncle, but I call him Uncle Glenn, Glenn Broadfoot, with a big smile. And I think I got a hug as well, which was wonderful. But they're greeting me with a smile. I was offered a cup of coffee by another community member, and we began an important conversation about what's needed for Canadians living with disabilities. And if there was one word that came out of that conversation, which I think encapsulates this piece of legislation and the hopes for this piece of legislation, is the word dignity. Dignity for Canadians living with disabilities. That conversation around that circle of chairs last Friday, the word dignity came up time and time again. One participant talked about how a haircut was considered a luxury. Another individual talked about how on the meager amount that she receives each month, she's not able to have a social life. She can't go even for a cup of coffee at the local coffee shop, at the local Tim Hortons, and have that interaction with the community. So when you hear stories like that, when you hear challenges like that, it becomes all the more important that we have this conversation today, of what we as Canadians and what we as parliamentarians want to see to support Canadians living with disabilities. Another participant in that conversation talked about how she worked a few hours a week, received a certain amount of money, but every time that she worked that hour, every time that she worked and brought home that paycheck, it was immediately clawed back from her monthly ODSP check. So while she was enjoyed and was able to do that opportunity, it was clawed back. So, Madam Speaker, when we come to discuss this piece of legislation, when we come to discuss what we want to see going forward with the Canada Disability Act, we want to encapsulate some of these concerns that have been expressed by people that I've met with, the people that all people in this House have met with. One of the challenges with a bill like C-22 is that it's the bare bones. It's the structure, it's the foundation, but it's not the actual meat on the bones. And that will come later through regulation. So I want to use the few moments that I have this afternoon to highlight some of the things that I think are necessary and what I think a lot of Canadians think are necessary to go into this piece of legislation. First thing is about clawbacks, and it has been mentioned a few times in this House about clawbacks, whether it's from provincial programs or other entities' work income. It is my hope that when the regulations for this piece of legislation are developed, that there are safeguards in place to ensure that when a dollar is earned through this benefit, a dollar isn't taken elsewhere, whether it's through a provincial program or through money that someone may have earned through workplace employment. Too often we see governments at one level give a dollar and governments at another level take a dollar away. So that's the first thing that I hope to see happen with this piece of legislation. And one thing that I want to highlight, and one opportunity I think is there, is that 2 parliaments ago, in the 42nd Parliament, this House debated a bill entitled the Opportunities for Workers with Disabilities Act. It was called Bill C-395 at the time, and this stood in the name of the now Leader of the Opposition, then the member for Carleton. But it was a bill that would have ensured that when an individual earned employment income, they were not negatively impacted in their other benefits, including and most specifically disabilities benefits. So one way that this bill, and I hope it will be considered at committee when we expect this to be taken up in the next few days, that they enshrine some of the principles from that bill to ensure that there's not that disadvantage. The other thing that I very much hope that we will see through this piece of legislation and when it's implemented through regulatory means is that it is done with a disabilities lens in mind. And what I mean from that is to ensure that this program is set up in such a way that is clear, understandable, and easy to use for anyone making applications to the program. We know that as Canadians, we file a lot of information with various government entities, whether it's the Canada Revenue Agency or Service Canada. They already have a lot of the information that would be needed to process this type of benefit. So it is my hope that when the regulations come into place, they're done so in a clear, efficient, and easy-to-use way so that Canadians living with disabilities from coast to coast to coast are able to access the benefits that ought to be provided through this benefit without additional means, additional barricades, additional blockages to prevent them from obtaining these important benefits. Madam Speaker, as I wrap up my comments about what my thoughts on this piece of legislation, I wanted to read a couple very short postcards that I received from constituents in my riding, which I think help to summarize the importance of a disabilities benefit and supporting Canadians living with disabilities. One constituent wrote me and said this: "We must take care of our most vulnerable. Only by lifting others up do we lift ourselves up." Another constituent wrote this. They wrote, "Such an important thing to look after and aid the people living with disabilities in our city and in our province and in our country. The challenges of poverty associated with disabilities is demoralizing. Please debate and pass this bill." Those are just 2 examples of constituents in my riding who have been pushing for this important benefit for a long time. Madam Speaker, as I wrap up my comments, I want to once again thank the many constituents who have contacted me on this piece of legislation, but specifically want to point out the good work that's being done by the folks at the local community food centre, working to bring all community members together in a safe, welcoming place which respects and promotes the dignity of persons living with disabilities. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Hear, hear.